And let me then start again by welcoming all of you. My name is Jeroen de Wolf. I'm the director of the UC Berkeley Dutch Studies program. And it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to our event with Professor Jan de Vries. Today's event is also the keynote lecture of the International Conference of Netherlandic Studies, a conference that this year is organized here in Berkeley, albeit virtually, by our Dutch Studies program. But we decided to make the keynote lecture available not only to the participants of the conference, but also to the general public. Many of you may be familiar with Professor Jan de Vries, who's the Sidney Heltman Erwin Professor of European History Emeritus, but professor still here in Berkeley of the Graduate School. Let me say a few words about Professor de Vries, who was born in the Netherlands, in the beautiful town of Ouder Amstel, but he came at a very young age to the United States. Nevertheless, he speaks flawless Dutch, has always been a great friend and a great supporter of our Dutch Studies program. Thank you for that, Jan. Jan de Vries graduated with a PhD in history from Yale University, then started his academic career at Michigan State and came to Berkeley in 1973, where until 2014, he was professor of history and economics. And as I already indicated, he's still active on the Berkeley campus as a professor of the graduate school. During his career at Berkeley, Jan de Vries also occupied several important administrative positions, such as Vice Provost for Academic Affairs, and later also as Dean of Social Sciences. His best known publication, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, is the book, The First Modern Economy, Success, Failure, and Perseverance of the Dutch economy from 1500 to 1815. A book that won the Ranke Prize, was selected the best book in European economic history, a book that has been translated also into several languages. Other publications that followed are The Industrial Revolution, Consumer Demand and the Household Economy, 1650 to the present from 2008, and most recently, The Price of Bread, Regulating the Market in the Dutch Republic from 2019. When I approached Jan to give the keynote address for the ICNS, he reacted immediately and he reacted enthusiastically. And he suggested to me a lecture that can appeal to a broad audience of people interested in Dutch studies in the broadest sense. The title of the presentation he prepared for us is Struggling to be Modern in Late 17th Century Amsterdam, Structure and Agency at the Aalmoezeniers Weeshuis. So Jan, thank you so much for agreeing to speak at our conference. And thank you also for having been such a great advocate for our Dutch Studies program for all these years. Your help and assistance was really crucial to us, and we're very, very grateful for this support. So without further ado, Jan, the floor is yours. We're eager to learn more about the Aalmoezeniers Weeshuis.
Well, thank you, Jeroen. Thank you for those kind words. And thank you also for your strong leadership of Dutch studies and for European studies on the Berkeley campus. It's always a lot easier to give support to a program that has strong leadership. Now, my talk today is struggling to be modern in early modern Amsterdam. The concept of modernity is not easy to define, and perhaps the most that can be said for it is that we know it when we see it. Even less tractable is the term early modernity. When historians use the term, usually to refer to the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, they are not only invoking a hard to define concept, but also modifying it in a way that begs for elaboration. just what was modern and what was not yet quite modern, that is early, about this period. So this talk offers a kind of historical example of microhistory, perhaps, that provides an occasion for some reflection on just what it meant to be early modern, or not quite modern, in a specific time and a specific place. It's a study of the interaction of a city, of an institution, and of a man in the final years of the 17th century. The city is Amsterdam, the commercial metropolis of Northwestern Europe. The institution is one of the city's orphanages, the Almoezeniers Weeshuis, we'll call it the Almoners Orphanage. And the man is a city resident, raised, if not born, in the city, and an applicant for a position that had fallen vacant at the orphanage. I'll begin what for me was the beginning. While working on a very different topic, I came across an entry in the minutes of the regents of the orphanage that caught my attention. Not because it was so unusual, but precisely because it was so familiar. As I read it, it seemed to correspond so closely to how we do things today. Well, why can't I get a new slide? Now, here we go. In 1692, the orphanage had a job vacancy, and this municipal institution had been established in 1665 to provide a home for children who were ineligible for admission to the many other orphanages already in the city, almost all of them under this purview of religious denominations. Which is to say, it took in the orphans from the most marginal of the city's residents, recent migrants, seafarers, casual laborers. Also, it took in the city's foundlings. The Almoners Orphanage then housed approximately 1,200 children in a large purpose-built structure. You just saw a picture of it, on the Prinsengracht. It later became the Paleis van Justitie. It was governed by a board of regents, 8 of them, 6 female regentessen, all of them appointed by Amsterdam's burgemeesters. And they had the task of administering the revenue supplied by the city and appointing a supervising staff of posten and other employees. And they appointed 3 schoolmasters, one for the girls' side, one for the boys' side. The boys and girls above 10 resided in separate wings of the building, and then one for the orphans in the kinderhuis, so for the younger children from 4 to 10 years old. Now, this vacancy had opened in April of 1692. This vacancy was for a schoolmaster for the girls' side. The previous schoolmaster had died, and the regent set about conducting a search to replace him. The job description was a reglement, 7 pages long, that spelled out the schoolmaster's duties under 24 separate headings. It was very detailed. A succinct statement of the schoolmaster's responsibilities happened to be provided in a somewhat later document, a few years later, and I'll paraphrase slightly from it. The schoolmaster has supervision of the girls above 10 years of age. He instructs the girls in reading and writing. He must also take care that the older girls are on time for work in their workshops, the woolen, linen, knitting, and embroidery workshops. Further, he must take care that they eat, sleep, and are awakened at the proper times. His wife, called the huismoeder, the house mother for the girls' side, must care for the sleeping quarters, the dining room, the yard, and the school on the girls' side, and has as many of our orphan girls at her service as the regentessen order. Here's a bit of a text from just a portion of his responsibilities that outlines what the schoolmaster must do when they take their meals. I just ought to ask you to take a look at that. And then take a look at this painting, which was done in the late 17th century, where you see everything that is mentioned in the reglement. One of the girls has been chosen to read from Holy Scripture. You see here in the distant center. The schoolmaster, I believe, is the man, the dark figure in the hat beside her. The girls are dishing out the food, and they are apparently being as quiet and as respectful as they can be. The job description goes on to address obligation to provide religious instruction, regardless of, and I quote again from the summary, regardless of the religion to which the parents had adhered, the children are taught and raised up in the Christian Reformed religion and are taken by the schoolmaster every Sunday morning and afternoon to hear the sermons, where they sit together in galleries made for this purpose in 3 of the city's churches. Now, there are 3 things to emphasize about this summary of the schoolmaster's duties. First, beside teaching the orphans to read and write, his educational tack emphasizes religious instruction, which was pursued primarily by the memorization of the questions and answers of the Heidelberg Catechism. Second, the schoolmaster supervised the overall daily regimen of the girls, their rising, working, meals, and sleeping. It was also the schoolmaster's task to lead his girls to church and to maintain order in the orphans' galleries. Third, and finally, the schoolmaster and his wife worked as a team. The wife, the Hausmutter for the girls, was expected to lead a team of older girls in the maintenance of the facilities. In short, these schoolmasters were much more than simply teachers. Now, nothing was said about how the position was advertised, since the candidates had been were assembled only 2 weeks after the regents had taken note of the death of the former schoolmaster. It's probable that notices were posted in public places and churches. Here you see such a public place on the Nieuwebrug near the Damrak, not far from the modern central station in Amsterdam. The applicants were all from Amsterdam and most lived nearby the orphanage. Here you see a close-up of the notice board. The regents conducted their interviews on the 16th of May, 1692. One after another, the applicants and their wives stepped inside the regent's chamber to, as they said, offer their services. And the minutes give evidence that the regents acted systematically, asking each applicant the same set of questions as we are expected to do when we interview candidates, say, for an academic job opening. The first to be interviewed was Jacob van Een. You note that they noted Jacob van Een's age, his wife's age. They were also interested in how many children they had. In the case of Jacob's wife, they had children 5 and 3, plus she was in the crown, that is, she was expecting a 3rd child. Jacob could write, they noted that, and his current position was schoolmaster in the Heilige Weg, a nearby street. These items reveal what the regents felt they needed to know about applicants for the position, and the same information was recorded for each of the remaining 8 candidates. I'll sort of scroll through these gradually here. They needed to know always about the wife. The schoolmaster's wife was expected, of course, to assist him in the housekeeping tasks. And the fact that all applicants were married confirms that this was a firm requirement for the position. They always noted the presence of children, the number and the age of children, plus current pregnancies of the wife. This seemed relevant in assessing the wife's ability to work with her husband, but also because the schoolmaster and his family lived in the orphanage and they received a room and board beside a salary. They always noted literacy, as one might expect for a schoolmaster. And they noted the previous work experience. They took note of the applicant's current position, of previous employment that might suggest abilities of the sort sought in a schoolmaster. After interviewing the 9 applicants, the regents consulted with each other and they settled upon a short list of 3. Who among those 9 seemed most attractive to the regents? 4 of them could not write. 2 had only limited writing ability. 3 were or had been schoolmasters, and 4 of the remaining 6 had experience in some kind of function that either required writing and arithmetic abilities or verbal skills, or both. Finally, one of the wives was pregnant and another, just married a quarter of a year, might be expected to be so soon. The regents decided to focus their further attentions on Van Eem, Jacob Meulevels, and Johannes Dakirius. The first 2 were already schoolmasters, although Meulevels' writing abilities were limited. The third, Dakirius, the proponent in the Reformed Church, mentioned no teaching experience, but as someone who had completed his theological training might be thought to be overqualified. At any rate, the regents clearly let experience and training weigh heavily in their selection process. The regents then deliberated over their shortlist candidates for a week, and on the 30th of May, they voted. And the minutes tell us that they, of the 3, Johannes Dakirius is chosen by a majority of the votes. Now, the regents then instructed 2 of their number to draw up a contract to present to Dakirius and to inform Moeder Sveers, the mother in charge of the management of the girls' side of the orphanage, of their decision. So, who was Johannes Dakirius, the successful applicant? It happens we know a few things about him. He was born in 1661 or 62, we don't know where. He married in 1683, and later that year, he purchased burger rights, that is, entitling him to the status of porter in the city. He listed his occupation then as a schoolmaster, although there's no record that he served in any of the public city-supported schools in Amsterdam. But he might have offered private instruction. When he solicited for the orphanage position, he did not mention being a teacher. He claimed to be a proponent, that is, an ordained minister approved for appointment by the Reformed Church for a pulpit. The normal route to such a status involved study at the university, which in turn required preparation at a Latin school. But Dakirius seems to have done neither of these. Now, so far, every aspect of the new schoolmaster's life leads to a kind of archival dead end. We don't know where he was born, anything about his parents. We can't confirm that he had worked as a schoolmaster. His claim to be an ordained minister of the Reformed Church can be substantiated, but the requisite education can't. So Dakirius is an elusive figure. But after some more digging, I found that he's not really an altogether unknown figure. There is a small literature about him, including an article published just a couple of years ago. It allows one to sketch a fuller portrait of the new schoolmaster. In fact, it allows one to sketch out more than one portrait. As for his clerical credentials, it turns out that Dakirius was one of the very few Reformed clergy of his time who attained ordination not by university study, but by examination. Reformed Church rules, as codified by the Synod of Dort in 1618, allowed laypersons who had been sufficiently trained in theology under the direction of local clergy to seek ordination via ecclesiastical examination. This was a path chosen by very few. It was exceedingly rare by the late 17th century. By that time, only Classis Groningen continued even to offer this option. And in 1690, Dakirius traveled there to take the examination. He succeeded in this, and later he succeeded in petitioning Classis Amsterdam to be enrolled there as a candidate for the ministry. But he was not successful in securing a pulpit. Even a position in Suriname, not an attractive assignment to most candidates, eluded him. And his lack of success in securing a pulpit was later ascribed to a pronounced stammer in his speech, although one might think that this might have been even a serious problem for a schoolmaster. At this point, I suppose that Dakirius's application for that position, schoolmaster's position, indicated he had given up on securing a church appointment, that he and his wife had reconciled themselves to obscure lives teaching the most socially marginal of Amsterdam's orphan children. Now, what could the orphanage regents have known of his theological views beyond the bare facts of his ordination? Well, it turns out they could have learned a great deal. For if he really was the poor speaker that was later claimed, he compensated for this by being a prolific writer. By the time of his orphanage appointment, Dakirius had no fewer than 4 published books to his name. His first book, published in 1685, was Rechtzinnige Harpstoffe, Orthodox lyrics, songs based on the Heidelberg Catechism. It sounds almost preposterous. It was an effort to put to music some of the questions and answers of the Heidelberg Catechism. And it was easy to imagine that he called these to the regent's attention as an example of his innovative pedagogy, since the Catechism was the basis for instruction in Reformed doctrine. And in the preface to this little book, he promises readers that it makes learning the Catechism both easy and pleasant. And then in the next year, he found time to write the Kortverhandeling der Algemene Kerkelijke Geschiedenissen, a short treatise of general church history. In this book, Dakirius presents the history of the church as a succession of challenges to true Christianity that each in turn had been resolved ultimately for the best. The most recent of those challenges that he discusses was the bitter debate within the Reformed Church between Gijsbertus Fuchsius and Johannes Copsius. Dakirius concludes his history with the rather complacent claim that the recent efforts at pacification between those two factions within the Reformed Church had brought matters to a fair conclusion, and there was no need for further polemics. It was a compromise that most people at the time saw as a victory for the followers of Copsius. So perhaps it was this more latitudinarian theological and philosophical position toward which he himself was then inclined. Soon thereafter, it appears that Amsterdam's Reformed clergy offered him some work as a broodschrijver. That's a wonderful Dutch word for what in English we call a hired pen or a ghostwriter. They hired him to write on matters for which the clergy themselves would rather not dirty their hands. And I give you 2 examples of that here in the PowerPoint slide. This work offered to him suggests that Amsterdam's clerical establishment saw some talent, theological or rhetorical talent, in Dakirius, who in turn did not hesitate to dedicate all of his publications to various of Amsterdam's leading clergymen. He was, you might say, a determined networker. So from one perspective, Dakirius was an aspiring theologian with rhetorical and intellectual skills valued by Amsterdam's Reformed clergy. But other commentators, people close to him and his time, offer less charitable assessments. Instead of seeing an industrious theologian acquiring his credentials, gaining the confidence of prominent clergy, and writing well-received and theologically mainstream books, they emphasize his marginal, even precarious position. he acquired his degree in theology by a highly unconventional route. He had no success in his search for a pulpit. His lack of success was also attributed to an unpleasant voice, and it was claimed an unpleasant personality. His book dedications were aspirational, efforts to ingratiate himself with superiors whose support he desperately needed. All he got in return was a bit of work as a hired pen, a gesture intended to quiet a troublesome supplicant. Meanwhile, he and his family lived from hand to mouth. In these years, 4 of his young children died, and at least one is known to have been buried in a pauper's graveyard. One of these versions of Dakirius, the well-connected theologian without office, or the failed ministerial candidate without prospects, applied for the position of schoolmaster at the Almoners orphanage in May of 1692. Or perhaps neither of these characterizations quite captures the true Dakirius. For neither quite prepares us for the figure who began to reveal himself, beginning just a few months before the schoolmaster position came his way. Actually, reveal himself is misleading, because Dakirius did everything he could to keep this new dimension of his life hidden from view, hidden from everyone. In late 1691, months before taking up his position as a schoolmaster, a new book appeared in Amsterdam bookshops, Het Leven van Philopater, The Life of Philopater. Its title page gives no author, while the stated publisher, Sievert van den Berg in Groningen, was a fictional publisher in a distant city. Now, what did the author and the publisher have to hide? These evasions seem necessary because the book addressed sensitive theological issues, and its author was our schoolmaster, Johannes Dakirius, and the publisher was Art Volschrein of Amsterdam. The book offers an account of the life of a young seeker of truth, Philopater. He first embraces the theological views espoused by the theologian Fuchsius. But seeing the error and shortcomings of this Orthodox Calvinist, he becomes an enthusiastic follower of a rival theologian, Coxius, until in turn his shortcomings too are revealed to Philopater. Now, in his court for Hundling of 1686, Dakirius had assumed a calm, fairly nonpartisan stance on this debate. But now, in Philopater, he heaped ridicule, first on one side and then the other. Both sides of the debate took some pleasure in his sarcastic demolition of the position of the other. But they could also see that the author, whoever he was, seemed to relish submitting religion and truth itself to an unremitting mockery. Moreover, it was hard to miss because it was trumpeted in the book's first pages. The authors fulsomely expressed admiration for another shocking book that appeared just months before, and that was Balthasar Becker's Betoverde Wereld, The World Bewitched. Now, Becker's book created an immediate furor and stands to this day as a landmark of early Enlightenment thought. So this is the fellow the regents had chosen to instruct the girls of the orphanage in reading and writing and the basics of true Christian religion. An advocate of one of the most radical, an advocate for the most radical philosophy of the age, or perhaps more correctly, someone who was then developing into such a figure. None of this appears to have been known to his employers. In fact, soon after his appointment, the regents approved his request to purchase a supply of psalm books from none other than Art Volschrein, the concealed publisher of Philopater, whose printing house then served as the hub of Amsterdam's free-thinking community to which the new schoolmaster had become connected. Volschrein's libertine reputation was already established. The Amsterdam magistrates had interrogated him concerning other publications in 1691, and he had business links to the publishers of Spinoza's works. Now, Dakirius did not last long in his position as schoolmaster, but neither his radical religious views nor his association with Amsterdam's advanced thinkers was the cause of his departure. His problem at the orphanage were of a very different sort, one immediately familiar to us today, and they began almost immediately upon his appointment. Dakirius' 18th century critics that, and by modern historians repeating them, that the regents found reason to dismiss him out of a suspicion that his conduct among the orphan girls under his tuition was less than honorable. This was definitely not the proximate cause of his departure from the position of schoolmaster, but the suspicions certainly were there. Dakirius had the misfortune to have begun his work as the girl schoolmaster at the same time that the schoolmaster in charge of the youngest children, ages 4 through 10, Lambert Pols, was dismissed for sexual misconduct. Pols had confessed, according to the regent's minutes, to having touched the children underneath their clothing. This event heightened suspicions and quickened imaginations among the orphans, the more so because Pols had substituted as schoolmaster on the girls' side after the death of Dakirius's predecessor. He was therefore well known to the older girls, and his scandalous dismissal occurred just as Dakirius assumed his work among them. Dakirius had the second misfortune to have gotten off on the wrong foot with the regentine, the orphanage's chief female regent, and Moeder Sfeers, the manager of domestic arrangements on the girls' side of the orphanage. Moeder Sfeers took offense easily and was not pleased that the male regents had left notice of Dakirius's appointment with her daughter during her absence. In January of 1693, after several months on the job, Dakirius meets with the regents to complain that this regentine had challenged the authority under which he worked. In addition, and more ominously, he was troubled by the regentine's accusation that he was in possession of een geheim briefje, a secret letter, which she demanded to see. Dakirius told the regents that he had replied to her that he carried out his duties on the authority of the regents as a body. That is, he answered to the regents, the male regents, and not to her. Whereupon the regentine became abusive. Dakirius then told her to take her complaints directly to the regents. Now, it's not clear from this account precisely what was at issue, the scope of Dakirius's duties or some sensitive issue that might be revealed by the content of a secret letter. The regents called the regentine to meet with them and explain what had motivated her dispute with the schoolmaster. It then becomes apparent that yet other female members of the orphanage staff claimed to have knowledge of an voorval, an event happening. Jannetje Moore, an employee, claimed that it was not at all her intention to spread rumors, but that Grietje Minne, another orphanage servant, had urged her to notify the regentine about this event, which is not further described in the regent's minutes. The regents expressed skepticism about the women's story, and especially about Grietje Minne's motives. They resolved, however, to avoid scandal and simply to admonish Jannetje Moore not to spread gossip and lies. They also called Dakirius in for further questioning. This added nothing of importance to the story. Underlying these only half-disclosed matters, there appears to have been a larger issue of just who had jurisdiction over the affairs on the girls' side of the orphanage. The wording of the council minutes gives the impression that the regent's sympathies resided with Dakirius and that they had their suspicions about the motives of the female staff and of the regentine. Dakirius labored under this unresolved tension until February of 1694. when his wife Janneke died. Within days, he found himself standing before the regents again, now to state that he understands that without a wife he cannot continue to fulfill the terms of his service. Nor, he went on, could he, and I quote, commit to bring in another. That is, he was not prepared immediately to remarry. He understood that he must vacate his position and asked only that while he still lived in the orphanage, pending the appointment of his replacement, he be permitted to accompany the children to church on Sundays. And the regents agreed. But before he could leave their chamber, the regents had a bone to pick with him. Had he not already tendered his resignation to the regentina before saying a word to the regents, who, after all, had appointed him? Dakirius hastened to assure the regents of his respect and replied that the regents had misunderstood. He had communicated to the regentina only that which concerned the duties of his wife, het vrouwenwerk, woman's work, and nothing more. Since the schoolmaster and his wife worked as a team in many respects, this distinction is not really so clear-cut, but the regents didn't pursue that point. The issue does, however, speak to the ongoing tension between the orphanage's male and female leadership. Dakirius worked on the girls' side, a domain of female regents, supposton, and orphans. But his work was men's work, under the direction of the male regents. His wife's work had been woman's work, appropriately under the direction of the regentina. As he saw it, his difficulties as schoolmaster had been caused by the orphanage women's unwillingness to abide by this distinction. So Dakirius had tendered his resignation, but the women were not yet ready to end their campaign against him. 1 week later, Kriet appears before the regents, claiming to speak on behalf of the regentina. She urges the regents to make haste in the selection of a new schoolmaster. The sick nurse and the lace instructress who had to assume the tasks of the deceased Janneke were overburdened, she claimed. Matters were in disorder, and furthermore, Dakirius was neglecting his duties, was rarely in school, and was frequently absent from the orphanage altogether. Regents accepted this information, but did not let the occasion pass to express their irritation with the regentina. Why did she persist in sending underlings to make her complaints? They then called Dakirius in to respond to the charges of neglect. He answered that he continued to attend his school as before, and that since his wife's death, he actually had been absent from the orphanage less than before. And the regents ended the meeting by instructing him, and to quote, to bring his absence to a minimum and attend well to his school so that they could part as good friends. Dakirius promised to do so. The regents then took steps to select his successor using the same procedure as before. Dakirius left the orphanage in mid-March of 1694, 2 months after Janneke's death. But Dakirius's resignation did not bring his involvement with the almoners' orphanage to an end. Less than a year later, January 1695, one of the regents informed the board that the old schoolmaster was a frequent visitor of the orphanage, spending evenings in the room of the kommoeder. Now, the kommoeder is the delousing person in charge of delousing the children's hair. A full-time job at the orphanage. He was there courting her daughter, smoking tobacco, staying until late in the evening. Master Peter, the shoemaker, confirmed that Dakirius visited nearly every day, that the kommoeder had a key to the gate with which he secretly let him out, but that there were nights when, to Master Peter's knowledge, he never left at all. The regents called in the relevant parties and forbade these meetings. Dakirius was to be refused any and all entry to the orphanage. This is a slide that shows the entrance, one of the entrances to the orphanage. But later that year, in August, Master Peter is back informing the regents that Dakirius had resumed his visits. He was in a position to know because his wife served as porter at the girls' side entrance. Moreover, Dakirius's visits were now made possible by the tacit consent of the regentina, his earlier nemesis. Just what was going on? Why had she now become his enabler? Well, we don't really know. The regents renewed their pronouncement that Dakirius was persona non grata, and this is the last we hear of Dakirius in the orphanage records. According to his critics, Dakirius a proofreader for the publishers who had been his friends and now provided him a meager living. He also returned to writing. In 1696, he published a school textbook, the Schouwburg der Nederduitse Letterspel en Leeskunst, the theater of the art of writing, spelling, and reading in Dutch. He presented this as the first of what should be several volumes that would offer up-to-date pedagogical guidance on reading, spelling, and writing, and in future volumes, much more. He must have hoped to make money with this venture, but it never got beyond volume 1, perhaps because he turned his attention to another project. His poverty, if this is what it was, did not prevent him from remarrying in 1697, and his new wife, Lijsbeth Schouten, was evidently not the Kammoeder's daughter he had courted so intently 2 years earlier, but nothing much is known about her. In this same year, however, 1697, a second Philopater volume, Vervolg van het leven van Philopater, the life of Philopater continued, appeared. Like the first, the title page gave no author and showed the same fictitious publisher. Now, while that first volume had caused irritation in its irreverence, the second, a philosophical novel advocating Spinoza's views without disguise or apology, immediately generated a storm of protest. In this volume, Philopater comes to reject all conventional theology as inadequate and embraces fully the teachings of Spinoza. Philopater declares miracles to be impossible and the order of nature to be eternally fixed and immutable, which is to say there was no such thing as divine providence. He denies free will. He declares the teachings of Descartes to be absurd. Even Balthasar Becker, his brave teachings of a few years early, he now dismissed as wholly inadequate. Now, the famed Dutch toleration for religious and political writing was indeed remarkable by the standards of its time. There were few places where a book such as Becker's Betoverde Wereld could have been published. But Dutch tolerance did not extend to its protection to atheistic writings. In 1653, the States of Holland had prohibited the publishing of Socinian books in the Plakkaat of that year. That is, books rejecting Orthodox Christian understandings, as I described here, of the doctrine of the Trinity, the divinity of Christ. And it provided a severe punishment for publishers of such books, monetary fine, 8 years imprisonment, and followed by 25 years banishment from Holland. This had not prevented publication of Spinoza's books, but in 1678, after his death, they were indeed banned. Now, within weeks of Vervolg's publication, the Reformed Church consistories of several cities had spotted the book's dangers, had urged their magistrates to ban it, and had appealed to Holland's High Court, the Hof van Holland, to banish it throughout the province, and other provinces quickly followed. Meanwhile, in Amsterdam itself, the Reformed Church consistory identified the author of the new Vervolg volume and the publisher to be Dakirius, the author, and Volschrein, the publisher. And in January of 1698, it asked the Amsterdam City Council to investigate and take action, to ban the book and to punish those responsible. The council interrogated Volkskrijn on the 8th of March and Dakirius a week later. Both denied responsibility, but physical evidence betrayed Volkskrijn. Many copies of the book remained stacked up in his bookshop. He had printed 1,500 copies. Volkskrijn received his punishment, exactly what the Plakat of 1653 prescribed, a very severe punishment. Next, the council turned to Dakirius. His authorship was confirmed by no one less than Balthasar Bekker. Bekker testified before the magistrates that he had met Dakirius, who had revealed himself to be the author of Philopathic. But this testimony was hearsay. Absent hard evidence of Dakirius's admission to authorship, which he steadfastly refused to give, the magistrates declined to act against him. They also hesitated, it appears, because while the Plakat forbade publishing Socinian books, it did not explicitly forbid writing them. The Amsterdam consistory then resolved to act where the civil magistrates had been unwilling to act. The consistory had received reports that Dakirius led a sinful and disorderly life, that he was frequently drunk, he beat his wife, and lived separately from her. On the basis of his persisting moral failures, the consistory excommunicated him, and the classis of Amsterdam rescinded his ordination. Now, Dakirius was denied communion and effectively denied any future hope of employment by public bodies, but he remained a free man. The bulk of Vervolg's large print run was destroyed, preventing him from benefiting economically from his notoriety. He resumed his work as a proofreader for Amsterdam printers, and his new wife bore him a son, Johannes, in 1699. Whether or not their life together was as nasty and brutish as proclaimed by the consistory, it was certainly short. Lisbeth died in 1701, and Dakirius followed her in death the next year. He was 40 years old. His Philopater volumes lived on. Their physical scarcity did not prevent several later authors from writing tracts denouncing his work and defaming his person. And of course, the philosophical message conveyed by his books went on to form an important part of the foundation of the radical Enlightenment, a current of thought that would only grow in importance. Dakirius, to be sure, was a popularizer rather than an original philosopher. But his popularizations required both bravery and erudition. How did he acquire that erudition? The extent of his formal schooling is not known, but he was, as the saying has it, literate but not Latinate. He did not have the education that would have prepared him for university study. Nor do his humble background and the straitened circumstances of his brief life help explain how he could participate so extravagantly in advanced intellectual life. His one advantage, certainly, was his residence in Amsterdam. If the intellectual trajectory that can be followed in his works can also be taken to reflect his own actual intellectual development, then his drift from Christian orthodoxy to Cartesian skepticism to full-blown Spinozism appears to have taken place within a community of critics, skeptics, and freethinkers centered around a cluster of publishers, a specifically urban phenomenon. This urban phenomenon made it possible to attempt earning a living via commercial publishing, and it also offered a degree of protection to unorthodox thinking. To be sure, Vervolg was banned, and Art Volkskrijn, its publisher, was severely punished. Dakirius himself lost his ordination and was excommunicated by the Reformed Church. But at the same time, the civil authorities acknowledged their own limits. The laws were restrictive, but the magistrates did not go beyond them, even with an unsympathetic figure, such as our schoolmaster, a man without money, without social standing, or, it appears, social graces. So Dakirius' life appears modern in the commonplace sense that we recognize him as a familiar urban type. And his employer, the Almoners Orphanage, can also be described as a modern institution. It was not a medieval foundation. The city established it to be a cost-effective instrument of civic improvement. And Dakirius, of course, provided instruction to girls. It's another sign of the orphanage's modernity that it provided essentially the same education to boys and girls. The new orphanage had a practical mission to raise up the poorest of the city's orphans to be both God-fearing and productive members of society. It undertook that task, both boys and girls. Both genders were educated and trained for the labor market. Now, it was a highly sex-segregated labor market, to be sure. But at age 18, the girls and boys both left the orphanage with a little outset, a little dowry. The girls with no ongoing adult male supervision to make their way in the world. So the Almoners Orphanage was modern in its goals and its methods, but it faced unyielding constraints on the realization of its aspirations. Life remained hard for the orphans. And so it seems to have been with Johannes Dakirius himself. He lived in a modern social and cultural environment, urban, free, information rich. He lived by his wits, it seems, and wrote for a commercial market without the protection or the support of patrons. Amsterdam provided him with the resources to achieve enlightenment. But he was also subject to the norms and values of the Reformed Church. And while that church's teeth had been dulled, they had not been wholly drawn. Moreover, Dakirius' success in securing an education and producing an impressive literary output, despite his humble circumstances, did not ultimately liberate him from the discomforts and the dangers of those circumstances. The harshness of daily life that confronted the orphans also pressed against the face of Dakirius. Yet the orphans and the schoolmaster struggled on, rowing against the tide, grasping at the opportunities that, despite everything the Dutch Republic offered, the modernity straining to emerge from the constraining structures of everyday life. Well, that's it, the story of Dakirius. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jan, for this wonderful lecture, and I'm especially grateful for the fact that you brought to us a lecture that make connections to so many fields, right? The field of history, of philosophy, of literature, religious studies, legal studies, and it corresponds, of course, in this way to the diversity of interests we have within our American Association of Netherlandic Studies. So I'm sure there's lots of questions. Maybe we could first end the PowerPoint. If you could perhaps do that, Jan.
Yeah. Well,
or we start the Q&A.
do I do stop share for that?
I think so. Yeah. Perfect.
Okay.
Excellent. Excellent. So we open the floor for questions. Those of you who have questions, please do raise your hand. If you don't know how to do that, you go to the bottom of the page where it says reactions. You click reactions, and then you will see at reactions an icon that allows you to raise your hand, and then I will give you the floor and you can ask your first question. I see Birgit. Go ahead, Birgit. Could you unmute yourself and ask a question, please?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for this very interesting talk. It's this kind of lives, which and they're not terribly famous, but then when you look into them, they really are a prism of the times and the individuality and the society together. So many strands of interesting studies and thoughts can come together in that figure. Thank you for presenting him. I just noticed a small thing. It's not important. I've noticed that the wives of these candidates were all most of them, they're older than their husbands.
Yeah.
Was that a widespread phenomenon for economic reasons, or what went on?
I noticed the same thing, and demographically in general, the age differences between men and women then were not fundamentally different from today. Men were generally older than their wives.
Yeah.
except in the case where there's been remarriage. Then you had all kinds of things that we don't so often see today with very great age differences. But yeah, I found that to be not typical, and I don't have an answer for it. Except for one thing, which was that it seemed to me, because I found evidence from a few other of these job searches they did, because these schoolmasters died like flies. They had several openings in a few years. And they died in part because everyone died in this orphanage. It was a very healthy place. But anyway, that they seemed to shy away from hiring people with very young wives because they didn't want them to be constantly pregnant, so they couldn't do their work. So it could be that there was an advantage to having an somewhat older wife to apply for the job.
Yeah. And one more question. Did the poor publisher really have to sit out all his punishment? Do you know about it, or was there?
I don't know. In the literature, it says that he was convicted and it was enforced, but whether it was fully enforced, whether he survived
my goodness.
his imprisonment, and what became of him later on, I don't know.
Very good. Then we go to perhaps the second question, if someone would raise the hand. And maybe while we're waiting, I use the opportunity, Jan, to ask a quick question myself, something that came up. I'm not sure if it makes sense or not, but I was wondering, couldn't the resigns have been alerted by the fact that he had this publication whereby the Heidelberg Catechism was put to music, right? Couldn't that be perceived as something frivolous at the time, something that was kind of an indication that he was not very serious as a scholar and potentially problematic?
Yeah, look, in the small literature that does exist, there's one very good article written quite recently by a Dutch historian named Johannes. And she's particularly interested in the what you might call the reasonable religion of the second half, late 17th century. The notion that the Reformation should be to be completed needed to be more rigorous in purifying itself from the superstition and the idolatry that it had originally criticized in the Roman Catholic Church. And that, so that what we sometimes see as almost irreligion, as the sort of the first step away from religious belief, they saw as a higher, purer form of true religious belief. Important part of that was what they called the movement of the catechism, of teaching the catechism, of giving formal instruction to folk religious, to reduce the scope of folk religious belief and to increase the level of religious understanding. Now, in that context, this kind of popularizing of the Heidelberg Catechism would have been seen as a step forward, as a step, not as a frivolous thing, but as a part of this movement of reaching down into the folk beliefs of the population who were nominal adherents but didn't fully understand the tenets of the faith. I don't know if this is really the case, but it would be an argument in his favor. And he did, if you follow the reglement of the schoolmaster, teaching the questions and answers to the Heidelberg Catechism, having his children tested by one or another of the Reformed clergy of the city every week or two to see how good a job he was doing. This was at the very heart of his job. This was the very core of the teacher's responsibility. If they had thought it was a frivolous thing, I think they wouldn't have hired him.
Yep, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jan. I briefly saw a hand from Yolanda. I'm not sure, Yolanda, if you have a question. You could unmute yourself.
I'm so sorry, I was muted.
Perfect.
Just a very quick follow-up on that. I was wondering, and again, speculation, but perhaps you can tell me, would setting the catechism to music be viewed as a way of making it easier to memorize for perhaps illiterate people or non-Latinate people?
Yeah, well, certainly. That's what he claimed, right? In the preface, he said, this makes it pleasant and easy. If you put anything to rhyme, certainly if you give it a bit of a melody, for me, I can remember all kinds of bits of songs I learned 50 years ago, right? But I don't remember poems and I don't remember texts, but I remember music. So it seems to me that this would have been a pedagogical tool, right? To get students, particularly, look, he's teaching as I said, the most marginal of students. These were the children of the poorest people. He was supposed to instruct them in reading and writing so that they could read the catechism and come to memorize it. But clearly, this was going to be an uphill struggle. And his first publishing venture would seem to have been a calling card to a potential employer. He had an idea of how to get this done.
Yeah, I see that Jesse has a question, and then Harm. Jesse, go ahead.
Yes, Jan. Thank you for a wonderful talk. I have a seemingly simple question, but I feel like it often is really difficult to answer, which is, how much time do you think his teaching duties would have actually taken in his day? So I'm just thinking about, how much time he had to go out and be part of these radical publishing networks, and could he just leave his wife essentially to do the real work, and he comes in on Sunday, or he comes in once a week or whatever and does a little bit. So how much time do you think he was actually working?
Yeah, I find it hard to reconcile his formal teaching duties with his productivity as an author. If his days were conducted as the reglement insisted they should be, he was busy from the minute he awoke early in the morning until he and his wife put those children to bed in the evening. Between the two of them, I mean, he had an assistant, a schoolmaster's assistant to help him. He had hundreds of girls under his tuition. They were divided into two groups. They were from age 11 to 18. The older girls were awakened at like 4 a.m. It varied by season a bit, but in the winter it was a little later. But in the summer it was 4 a.m. They were and the older girls went to school beginning at 5. At 7, they went to their workhouses, their workshops to learn lace making and embroidery and all the textile trades, and then to actually produce all the clothing that was worn in the orphanage. And then the younger girls came. He taught them until 11, and then they had lunch. And you saw the picture of all the girls at lunch, at dinner, really. Then the younger girls went back for instruction in the afternoon. He was teaching them until they go out to play, and the girls who'd been working all day come in for a second round from 5 to 7 at night. Then he has to see to it that they're fed and that they go to bed. Now he has his wife to help him with all of those things, of course, but he has to oversee all of that. That takes up his full day, 6 days a week. And then on the 7th day, he's leading the orphans all in their livery, marching down the street, going to the Westerkerk and sitting in the galleries. And he does that again in the afternoon. So Sunday is not exactly free either. He really has no time to do any of this. So here we have the historian's problem of we see a document that shows what he was supposed to be doing hour by hour, day by day. And then we have evidence that he had a lot of time, it seems, to do other things. How did he reconcile them? When the orphanage staff complain he's not tending to his school, he's away from the orphanage more than he should be. Now that's after when he's about ready to leave. That suggests that perhaps this kind of thing had happened before. Who took his place? What happened to the school in those days and the hours? Why was that never brought to the attention of the regents? The past is a foreign country. There's a lot about it we don't know. And I don't really have an answer to that question.
Thank you, Jan. I see that Herman has a question. Herman? Unmute yourself. Yeah.
So I also wanted to say thanks for a fascinating talk and amazing piece of archival work as you, piece together the life and mystery of this of Dakirius. What I'm wondering is, since he violated the placat and was excommunicated and so forth, and the publisher banned, are these books, the 1691 and then the continuation, the 1697, are these nowadays, rare of the rare books? Were many destroyed? Is this really hard to get your hands on? I am assuming that it's digitally available now, but yeah. What was the plight of the actual book?
Yeah, well, okay, with the first volume, that was never banned. Okay, I mean, it irritated a lot of people, but it never triggered the response that the second volume did. And so I don't know how many copies were published, but they were not banned or destroyed. The second volume is just a different story. The publisher was apparently hoping for this would be a bestseller because 1,500 copies was a lot. And we don't know exactly how many survived, but all those that were found in the bookshop were confiscated and were later destroyed. So there weren't very many copies around, but there were always some. In the 20th century, I mean, in fact, I think 30 years ago now, there was a literary scholar who wrote a kind of a dissertation on the Philopater volumes and wrote a critical edition of them with an introduction, and it summarizes as much as was known at the time about Dakirius's life. And I don't recall that she said very much, but it might be that I just wasn't interested to note it, about how many copies survived, and but it became clearly a rare book. There weren't very many, but there were some. His name lived on really because of the people who denounced him afterward. So there were several pamphlets decrying his work and defaming his person from just before his death and in the first half of the 18th century. Then people lost interest in him. And only at the end of the 19th century were there some people who were great fans of Spinoza who began to look back and say, hey, here's a fellow who tried to popularize and spread the word. And he was cast in a more favorable light. And they had access to his work. So it's not as though there were no copies, but there were only a few.
Thank you.
Well, I look at the clock and I see that meanwhile it's 3:05. So before I give the floor to my colleague Esme to say a few words about tomorrow's program, let me say that that I hope that all of you enjoyed the first day of our conference, and I hope you all enjoyed the keynote lecture by Jan de Vries. So allow me then to ask you all to join me in thanking Jan for a wonderful lecture, very interesting, very fascinating, and also for the excellent Q&A. So thank you so much, Jan. Very grateful for your participation at our conference.
Well, thank you.